Hello, students. This is Dr. Martin from U.S. Government. I just wanted to pick up today on where we were last time, namely the tail end of the presidency. And there are a couple of things that I would like to address before we move on to additional parts of the executive branch, namely the bureaucracy. Now, at least part of that has to do with something that is not necessarily on the president's list of duties when it comes to Article 2 in the Constitution, but ones which have been considered traditionally part of what the president can use. The one that you're probably going to see the president use most often is something you know from every day, namely the power to persuade, as it's called. Anytime that there is a major address that needs to be made to the country, whether in time of war, a time of, say, pandemic like the present, or some other major kind of national affair, the different news networks are going to give free airtime, basically, to the president to receive whatever it is the president has to say. And therefore, you have, in many ways, a captive audience. Anytime that the president wants to say something, there will be an audience there because all those different media organs that are going to cover it are going to give the president basically the attention he or she needs. There are also exceptions to that. Different speeches you're going to see obviously come and go. State of the Union is one of those. Press conferences are a particularly interesting one because this is something where the president can actually give and take with the reporters who are covering White House affairs in the room. Some of the president's most notable actions in this regard have been when they interact with and argue, actually, with various reporters. This has actually been a consistent feature of the Trump White House. You have a very adversarial relationship between reporters during press conferences with the president. He has revoked certain journalists' credentials as part of that, belittles them in the presence of the actual conference itself. And so sometimes this sort of thing can be a way that the president not only answers or does not answer questions, but can also be seen answering or not answering questions to the extent that their base can see that they are dealing with a hostile media environment. One of the things that is a feature, however, that has not gone away, no matter which person has been in the White House for a very long time, has been weekly addresses. Now, typically, back in the Great Depression, this is where some of this sort of tradition began, where you had President Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually giving what they called fireside chats over the radio to the American people, trying to explain what his administration was doing. In the case of weekly addresses, these are typically these days streamed over the internet from the White House, with the president actually delivering the address of what they've been doing, updating viewers and the American public of what has been taking place on their agenda that week. Now, however, there have been notable deviations from this, and I will post a link to one particular one from 2012 that I would like you to pay attention to. This occurred just after the killings in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, at the one elementary school, in which you had a serious concern and a serious question about to how much degree was this the fault of availability of guns. And so, as a result of some of the debates surrounding that incident, you had a number of proposals put forward in Congress to try and deal with access to firearms under those circumstances. However, what the president did in his weekly address 2012 2013 was a particular technique which I think many people had not been expecting him to do. President Obama invited actually the parents of one of the children who was slain at that school to give the actual weekly address for him to actually make the case for the kind of gun control reform needing to be passed and addressed in the Senate, and doing so in a way that had the public's attention in a way that no other kind of platform would have. When you watch that particular footage, I encourage you to think carefully. To what extent do you agree with what was said? Do you agree or disagree with it more because it is usually a president's platform that was given to this one grieving couple? And therefore, to what degree do you feel as though this was legitimate use of this presidential channel? And to what extent might you feel that there is some sort of emotional manipulation going on? I have heard both reactions, and I'm curious to hear yours. Moving on a little bit into what the president actually controls. We spoke of the president being CEO of the executive branch of the federal government. Now, it's sometimes difficult to spell out exactly what we mean by the bureaucracy because this can have, first of all, very different forms and also a wide variety of ways in which their work is carried out. When we speak of bureaucracy, we're speaking basically at this point over 2 million civilian employees, direct or indirect. Some of them are directly employed by the US government, some of them are contractors, and over 1 million who are actually serving in uniform in the armed forces. So when you look at the workforce of the federal government, you're looking at one of the largest in the country, if not the world. And so when we look at what it does, we need to have some sense of scale for what it is and what it does. Also, you'll want to keep in mind this is also something that should be an item that you could find in your textbook. It has to do with the different forms of bureaucracy that you're actually going to find within the different kinds of agencies involved. Some of them are going to be ones that you know fairly well. Namely, they get called departments. These are the ones that are actually part of the cabinet, such as State Department, Defense Department, Justice Department, and so on. However, you can also find bureaus within departments. The easiest bureau that you could probably think of would be the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Justice Department. There are also independent agencies of various kinds, and there are ones that are not even technically fully governmental organs. They might be called, for example, quasi-governmental corporations. So the range of what they are, to whom they report, and what exactly the control the federal government has over them varies widely. Now, why is it that you see the levels of bureaucracy you do? What exactly are they? In a way, you could say that they are there to fill in the gaps. A lot of the laws that Congress is going to pass, they can be fairly general, they can be fairly vague. They set goals, but they don't always say how to get there. So, what you have in the case of any given bureaucracy is a way in which they try and implement those goals, drawing on the expertise of the people and specialists they have in their organization. They try and see if they can translate that into something flexible and practical, and therefore can they fill in things that are more specific than the general rules they got from, say, Congress. Having done so, they try and make sure they enforce these rules as best they can. Now, because of the way that bureaucracies do have to flesh out those rules, sometimes it can seem as though, in effect, they're making law themselves. That's not an unfrequent criticism. But I think it is going to be important to see that to a considerable degree, bureaucracy is only there because the members of Congress have authorized them to be there. And they've only authorized them to be there because of what the American people, people living in the United States, have said they want. Now, there are a number of organizations and agencies that are worth taking a look at, some of which you've gotten to know quite well in the last several months. CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, obviously at the top of the list. Some of them even more everyday than that, say the Food and Drug Administration. This is a feature from about 100 years ago during the Progressive era, regulating over $1 trillion in consumer goods, pretty much, and around 25 cents of every dollar is pretty much going to be to them. And in terms of what they're going to do, it's about half a trillion in food and about a quarter trillion in drugs in terms of what is they actually are going to be regulating. Now, there's some actually that you may have heard of that you may not consider part of the federal government quite as much. And to a certain extent, there are corporations that the government can fund and doesn't fully control that are ones you probably have heard of. The biggest ones being the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and its public broadcasting service, which you know as PBS, fittingly enough. Specifically, the kind of channel which provides a lot of public and educational programming. Many of you will probably be familiar with some of their programming, the various iterations of Sesame Street, Arthur, the likes of Bernie the Purple Dinosaur. All of these at one point or another have featured on this channel. Series of channels, actually. Every state has their own affiliates. What you also saw, therefore, is that sometimes there are arguments over its content. Is the thing that is appearing on a given news report or a given documentary or a given children's show something that is without political bias? In many cases, activists on the left or the right have not thought so. And some of the demands made about this bureaucracy, about how much they'd like to see it funded or funding cut, will come accordingly to that. One humorous incident kind of took place in the 2012 election where there was some discussion about what you're going to cut from the federal budget. And Mitt Romney at one of the debates spoke and said, I like PBS, I do love Big Bird, but I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for. He was quickly derided by lovers of the likes of Sesame Street and regular viewers of PBS, which spawned a host of protests and a host of very interesting internet memes, which I'll also send you if you're curious. But I think it's interesting to note that this, as in many other cases, you need to read the fine print about what the agency actually is and does before you make some judgment about whether it's a good investment on the part of the federal government. Namely, the percentage of PBS budget that comes from the federal government, that in Corporation of Public Broadcasting, that percentage is in the single digits. The vast, vast majority of that kind of money comes from their individual subscribers, like you and your families nationwide. So the degree of control the government will have over one of these is going to vary quite a bit. Now, in terms of a couple of features of how bureaucracies behave, there are a number of things I want to try and unpack. One of the things you'll often hear about bureaucracy, and this you'll hear repeated from members of Congress on down, is that it's inefficient. Now, there's no doubt that this is certainly the case, but there's also a question of why would they be inefficient? What exactly are they working against? And a lot of it has to come from pressure from the need for disclosure of what they're doing, pressure placed on them by Congress responding to political demands, and frankly, the kind of missions they have, which are going to contradict themselves. They're trying to sort out directions which seem at odds with each other, and doing so with the public and Congress breathing down their backs. The IRS does this all the time. They're one of the least popular agencies, but accordingly, they don't get as much help from the federal government in terms of budget by Congress, which only makes them do their job worse. And you can see how this becomes a repeating cycle. In our next iteration of these notes, I'll try and break down that there is a logic as to why, to a certain degree, these bureaucracies in the federal government behave the way they do, and that we can see that this is going to influence very much not only the forms bureaucracies take, but also, in particularly, the kind of performance that they exhibit, for better or worse. We'll come to that in just a minute.